Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the conference, and I'm excited for the session today, which I think is going to be a really interesting and thought-provoking conversation with Dr. Plumb. I'm going to go by Radha. I think before we kind of dive into the content of this, let's do some intros for everyone. I'll kind of lead off. I'll make mine quick, and I think everyone would love to hear how you end up as CDAO, and we'll have a kind of great free-flowing conversation, and then hopefully leave a little bit of time for some questions if there are some. And so everyone, as has been mentioned, I'm Raymond, founder and CEO of Unstructured. We focus on ingestion and pre-processing of unstructured data. We have an open source project and a commercial offering. My background, though, let's call it like a non-linear career path. So started out at CIA as an analyst at the CIA for a number of years, then moved down and worked in the Obama administration. I was a director on the National Security Council. And then 2018 timeframe, back out here to San Francisco. I'm from Northern California. Worked at a company called Primer AI for a while where we were doing knowledge graph generation, and then founded Unstructured a couple years ago. But Radha, over to you.
Thanks. I too had a nonlinear career path. I have a PhD in economics, and I sort of started out on a traditional academic track, was an assistant professor, and then went off to Afghanistan to do some research, and ended up through a series of events after that going into the government and working in the Pentagon and then at the National Security Council and Department of Energy, really focused on creating sort of applied analysis informing policymaking processes and decisions. Left government in 2016 and went out and worked in tech. So I started out in Facebook. I was a UX researcher and then ran a team of researchers and data scientists, went to Google, ran a slightly bigger team, really focused on both on the business process side and then on the detection and sort of platform management side in Google. And then in 2021, went back into government somewhat unexpectedly, but as the Deputy Secretary's Chief of Staff. And from that seat, coming back into government, having been out working at tech companies, was really surprised at the place in the data journey the Department of Defense was, maybe I'll put it that way, and what a lot of folks take for granted, the kind of availability of analytics to drive decision making, the ability to test and field different types of applications to meet internal or external needs. That's a lot harder in the government. So really have spent time in a variety of roles inside the government, first on the Deputy Secretary's immediate staff, sort of helping build some of the foundations, and then in the acquisition roles, and now as a Chief Digital and AI Officer, really focused on trying to make concrete progress along that journey to get the department to be a place that has data-driven, cutting-edge solutions to the full range of problems that they're trying to deal with.
Well, let's pick up on that for a minute. And I think for a lot of us out here in San Francisco, it could be acronym soup, looking at like the Pentagon and this incredibly large organization with the services nested underneath it. Can you just talk a little bit about the origin of the CDAO, mission today, and then as you've come into the seat over the past 6 months to lead it, what are your priorities kind of looking forward?
Yeah, so I think the easiest way to think about the Pentagon is $1 trillion warfighting and sort of enterprise-wide machine, really focused on two things: the sort of defeat adversaries and maintain national security, and then the manage 3 million person, $1 trillion enterprise and all of the business execution functions therein. So just starting there. There are lots of different parts of it. There's an Air Force, there's a Navy, and there's what's called the Office of the Secretary of Defense. The core thing to think about that is that's like the cross-cutting core platform team that needs to build and maintain all of the pieces, the budget and financing, the personnel that help all of those action-oriented pieces keep moving. CDAO really came from identifying when we came in 2021 with the Deputy Secretary, the realization that we had these real pockets of progress in the digital data and AI spaces. So we had a defense digital service, we had this enterprise analytics platform called Advana, we had the Joint AI Center, the JAIC, and we had these teams that were we had Maven doing really cutting edge work at the time on AI. We had these teams that had pockets of excellence, and we really needed to build the foundation and scale that to have a meaningful ability to advance the department's journey. So that's really where the CDAO came from, a couple of sort of pockets of excellence, and the theory of the case that the sum of the parts was greater if we put them all together, so that you could have the data infra, really, then the data analytics and the AI infra and the AI applications all together with the policies and acquisitions that enable that to come into the government and scale, and sort of that's where we are in CDAO. In terms of my priorities, if you think about CDAO as in those functions to enable the department to accelerate its adoption, to build the scaled foundations for that, and then to accelerate priority applications, our priorities are really in that order, right? Which is, do we have the right acquisition tools, the right policies, the streamlined process for ATOs, all of the things that make it go to enable that? And then do we have the right foundations, the scaled data infrastructure, the compute, the AI infrastructure, the labeling data, the dev environments, and then what are our priorities in terms of applications that we want to take our kind of limited bandwidth and try to rapidly scale to prove the value proposition of those other two arms.
Yeah. So the world's changed a lot in the last, call it 18 to 24 months. November 22, OpenAI releases ChatGPT, which came on the heels of, GPT 3.5, and this explosion of activity, not only from the model providers, but also at the hardware layer, and then open source projects, and an entirely new ecosystem of tooling that's emerged since that time. I know a lot of the problems have remained the same over the last several years in terms of, compute and data. What's changed? What sort of new opportunities are unlocked with this new kind of generation, this paradigm shift in technology that we've witnessed? And how's the conversation shifted in Washington around this technology?
There's a lot of enthusiasm about sort of generative AI sort of broadly, but more the realization of the value that AI poses, the potential and some of the risks, but a lot of potential for transforming how the government does business. And again, just going back to the two missions that framing, like it has the potential to transform warfighting, but it also has potential transformation on the bureaucracy side to really help us accelerate and speed or add rigor to a number of our internal processes. So the conversation is really focused on how does the government government generally, and for us, the Department of Defense specifically, make meaningful progress into that. To that end, a lot of what has changed for us is focused on, rather than buying things, I like to say the way we would buy things was basically from the app all the way down the stack. So we would buy these vertically integrated, hey, I like that UI, I'm going to buy the whole stack. I like that UI, I'm going to buy the whole stack. A lot of overlapping investments on the back end there because we're buying these fully vertically integrated things, to having a more federated, modular, interoperable model that has a lot more providers and a lot more promise for allowing our user base inside the department, decision makers or warfighters or operators or financial planners, to be able to self-serve and identify the solutions they need with the underlying infrastructure and investments that allow that self-service model. And so I think that conversation has changed, the realization there's just a lot of potential use cases. And we need to build the enabling functions and infrastructure to support users actually using the applications they want.
That's really interesting. So it sounds like a lot of like bottom-up development and creating conditions for success of, this particular, air wing or this corps may want to develop an application. How can we provide the infrastructure to do that? And broadly, it's fitting into two different buckets. One might be kind of like back office business efficiency. And another one is, instead of advancing like top line, let's call it advancing deterrence instead of war. That's a nice way of putting it, advancing deterrence. And but either way, it's a common set of potentially AI infrastructure that might sit underneath both of those kind of buckets of mission sets. Is that right?
That's right. And you can think about it. I'll use just the example of logistics because I think it's something folks can resonate with. The department owns more aircraft than Southwest, more ground vehicles than FedEx. We have a supply chain that has 3 times as many suppliers as Walmart. We have warehouses all around the country, and we need to be able to move things around to them, and that's true for supporting the military families who live on installations all over the world, and it's true for maintaining fuel supplies for our ships and planes and ground vehicles, right? And all of that is relying on, whether it's on the operational side or on the business management side, relies on the same kind of underlying raw data sources. How you put them together and deliver that for different uses is really the question, and how you make that, what the warehouse managers need is going to look different than what the fleet managers need when they're maintaining fuel supplies. But we want them to be able to build and be able to source solutions to all of their problems with a common set of infrastructure investments that make it easier for them.
One thing that I'd love to hear you talk a little bit more about is that, in the private sector, compute has been a constraint, and there's been enormous competition over access to compute, but there's this thriving ecosystem of players ranging from the cloud service providers to the hardware manufacturers themselves to the CoreWeaves of the world and others that are stepping up to kind of meet that demand. Within the Department of Defense and across the services, different environment, right? You have classified networks, you have protected networks, and priority number one is protecting those networks, but then you also need to kind of step up to meet the moment on how technology is changing. And so how has the department been looking at that unique challenge of how do you one, buy all of this, deploy all of it, operationalize it, so that you can enable the folks on the front lines?
Yeah, so we certainly have unique problems unique constraints in the department. We have these classified networks, as you said. We have a sort of distributed operations. We have a lot of cyber requirements, rightly so. But I'll just note, those are all problems that exist in different ways in the private sector, right? Having different people with different identity and access to different kinds of information is a problem that they solve in healthcare and in finance. And so in the department, I think there are a couple things we have tried to do to get better. One is just try to have a clearer process that goes from solutions all the way to fielding. And the reason that is if there are solutions that people have been thinking about in the commercial sector, we want to be able to bring those technology solutions, the technologists, into our environment to help us solve them. In order to do that, we need to have a process that walks from, we have a requirement, we go out to industry and explain that requirement. People come to us with potential solutions. We can give you initial funding, whether it's through sort of these small business or smaller contracts. SIBRs are the common example, but there are a range of different authorities. See how that works, test it out. If that looks good, fund a prototype. If that looks good, have a process to get to either enterprise scale with licenses or to use it in the right environments. We need to be able to step through that process. In CDAO, we've been doing a lot. We have this initiative called Open Dagger. It's a long acronym that relates to having government-owned interoperable repositories for data and applications. But the idea there is to have this end-to-end process that technologists can see from the beginning, getting all the way to the solution. So that's one big piece, is just having that. The second is to try to start buying our pieces of infrastructure in more modular ways, right? So we don't want that vertically integrated stack because it creates a lot of constraints on what solutions are available to end users, and it buys the stack for the solution rather than creating a stack and letting more different kinds of solutions come in and sort of democratizing that process. So what we're trying to do with things like, we have a program called Alpha One, that's our AI infrastructure program, to actually try to fund, okay, what are the pieces that need to come in here, data labeling or MLOps, right? What are the core pieces we need in that AI infrastructure? How does that fit with our data infrastructure? Right now, our data is very focused on analytics, so we're also making some investments to have a more flexible back end on the data side to enable more of that AI infrastructure to interact with it. But we have to buy these in pieces, and so we're working our way through that in a couple of different lines of effort. We've done it on our what we call strategic command and control. That's on sort of operational data. We're now doing it on enterprise analytic data that has as I mentioned, the warehouse data, the logistics, the finance, the personnel data, and then we'll look at different areas to do that. But that's kind of the overall approach.
That's really interesting, and I think what is coming out of this conversation is that a lot of when our company we do a lot with private sector and especially large enterprises, and the broad approach seems very similar, which is hey, I'm gonna they want modular and interoperable solutions. They want to be able to compose their own AI platforms quickly and be able to swap in and out different providers. The switching costs are still pretty low right now, right? There's not a lot of sunk investments necessarily on like which LM you're using, or which vector or graph or relational database you're maybe using, or orchestration framework. There's still like we're still in this period of like, let's call it extreme experimentation, right? And this thriving ecosystem of companies, many of which are represented here today, are adding to that and advancing that. And so like that's great to hear around kind of aligning acquisition and broader strategy towards making it easy and fast to plug in these capabilities against these different mission sets. Maybe for the benefit of everyone here and for myself, just practically speaking, how does DoD, like at the CDAO level, interface with what maybe Army's doing and Navy and Air Force? It can get a little dizzying just to understand who's responsible for what, and how do I plug in being like a San Francisco-based or West Coast-based tech company?
Well, the short answer is we have a lot of meetings, a lot of them in 30-minute increments. The longer answer is we have a couple of different, I will call them sort of bureaucratic structures intended to pull these things together. So the first is we maintain inside CDAO these defense-wide program lines. What that means concretely is Congress gives us money. We get all our money from Congress. Congress gives us money for defense-wide investments in infrastructure and enterprise licenses. That allows us to take needs from other folks like armies or the combatant commands, like Special Operations Command or Central Command or European Command, to come to us to say, hey, you guys were given resources to help us. We have this significant need. We validate those needs and we fund them and then buy enterprise licenses at scale to try to maximize buying power, but also to get a common sort of set of tools available for folks. So through that process of sort of budget review and allocation and needs taking in, we get to understand the enterprise-wide requirements so that we can, just like really any large organization, prioritize and rack and stack. The second piece, and probably more interesting for this group, is CDAO, one of the functions we serve is as the chief data officer for the department. And in that, we just have a lot of powers of compelling people to do things, which is handy.
Give us your data.
Yes, data. I have actually my 5-year-old made me a magic wand, which I like to CDAO things.
You take it to meetings.
The data comes, like CDAO. And so, but in that context, we spend a lot of times working with the military departments, so the Army and the Navy and the Air Force, and understanding what they're doing and building, where it makes sense to have sort of foundational layer of investment that connects the different data sources, and where there are service-unique, service-specific activities that they should be doing, and how those architectures connect. I talk about it in the architecture sense because in some ways we don't need to, and it's actually a feature, not a bug, that we're not involved all the way at the application side, right? By the time we get to the applications, unless it's so ubiquitous, like that everyone needs to have it for us to all operate together, think document sharing, et cetera. But beyond that, we really want to allow and enable this sort of self-service application procurement and deployment and testing and experimentation so that people are getting fit for purpose applications. We just don't want to duplicate where we can. We want to minimize duplication on the layers below that. So we spend a lot of time with the military departments making sure that their service-centric architecture that's focused on feeding those application needs intersects effectively with our department-wide one, that they're interoperable, that the data can flow between them, and that we're not duplicating investments. For folks who are kind of at the infrastructure layer, what that means is two things. One, CDAO can be a helpful front door, which is even if your solution isn't a solution that is for a enterprise level solution, knowing what is available and out there in the marketplace is helpful for us because we can be a useful matchmaker. And the second is in reverse, which is if you're working with clients in the military, in the Army, or in the Navy, and you've got a solution that you think can port, we can help port that. We have things like, ATO reciprocity, we have our own authorizing official, we have our own acquisition authority, so we can help pull things across that transom where it can be hard when you've got a solution for one particular customer in the department to help figure out if it's appropriate to scale, how do we scale it? What does that look like?
Yeah, makes total sense. I think one thing, and we'll make sure we budget a little bit of time for questions here, but one thing I wanted to touch on is that this tension Radha, between and I see this in the private sector a lot, is an imperative to adopt competition among among companies for one, within industries, with also a need to do it responsibly and responsible AI. And so, how's the administration, how is the department, how is CDAO kind of approaching those twin goals and how they navigate that?
It's a good question. I'm actually just coming from Seoul, where there was a sort of multinational responsible AI conference, RAIM. And I say that to say this is a huge topic for governments across the world, industry and civil society, and it's, I think, an opportunity for us to fit together. DoD was the first military in the world, I think, to adopt these ethical principles of AI in 2020. We have a responsible AI team that's really focused on translating that strategy into implementable things. We have a toolkit. That toolkit is really intended to cover the full life cycle of tools across, from initial design and development, sort of responsibility by design, all the way through to test and evaluation, deployment and fielding, to make sure we have things like, hey, if you want to monitor your model, once you fielded it, like, what does that look like? What should you look for in model monitoring services? So all the way across that. That is the kind of at a tactical level, the how, because I think AI is a good example of a technology where policy, the words policy, isn't enough. You need to know the words, you need to have those values-based principles, but you need to translate that into technical solutions, or it's not going to be baked into the actual digital solution that's deployed and fielded. But at an even higher level, I think, a lot of times people ask, like, oh, what are you doing to deal with the fact that responsible AI slows you down or inhibits adoption or limits what you can adopt? And I challenge folks to really turn that question around, which is, what is it we're slowing down if responsibility, things like traceability and governance of your AI, what are you slowing down? Irresponsible AI? Like models that don't perform the things you want or in the ways you want, in ways that you can't verify and validate? So the question isn't really, are we slowing things down? The question is, how do you translate those values and principles that are really universal? They're not super controversial. They're not really owned by a particular country or company.
Yep.
How do you translate those into action so that people know how to, from the get-go, build in the design and the deployment all the way through the life cycle? And that's really where the toolkit comes from, which is, we know we need these, so let's just tell you how to do it so we can get on with the development and deployment.
Makes total sense. Awesome. Okay, I'm looking at our clock. We got about 3.5, 4 minutes left. Organizers, are we able to do a couple questions? Does that work? I know we got a big crowd here, but would love to make time for a couple at least. Go for it.
Yeah, there's a lot of startups here, and we would love to work with you or with the federal government, especially the urgency of the adoption of AI. As you said, you guys have a lot of data, and I'm sure you want to operationalize it. So how can many startups, and many of them are venture funded, they just don't know how to work with the federal government. So can you give us some email or somebody to talk to, or your email?
So let's give him Dan's email.
Yeah, so I'm not going to give you my email, but so just for the purposes of folks who might not be able to hear, because there's not a mic, the question is, how do you work with the federal government and the Department of Defense in particular? Two answers to that. One is we have a process in general. It's an acquisition process. Inside CDAO, we have a particular acquisition toolkit we're using called Tradewinds. So if you Google Tradewinds AI, it will come up. It has contact information. It has information on our industry days and how to access us and how to work with us and how to sign up for those. We have the next one, I think, next week in DC, but I think we have one planned for California later in this fall. I'm going to roughly say November-ish, but you should check the website because I don't recall off the top of my head. So that's just one bucket to understand, that we do have a front door there. We also have a front door with, we have an memorandum of agreement with the Defense Innovation Unit to help them to sort of serve as a front door for us here in California. So that's just a second option. And again, that is also available on the Tradewinds site, so you don't have to go somewhere else. More broadly, though, I'll just say, the whole part of what we're trying to do in CDAO is make the government less hard to work with, which is a lofty goal. But I think what that means is really to try to set up the point of these industry days, the point of having that website is to sort of demystify the process. Look, the bottom line is we have money and we need to put those on contract vehicles and then get the right approvals to use technology. So the first step in the contract vehicle is getting initial funding so that you can prove your technology solution works. We do those through challenges inside CDAO, but those are relatively small dollar things that just help us test your environment. If your tool seems like it's a good idea, or your technology solution, then we can move to a prototype, and those are slightly longer contracts, slightly bigger dollars, and relatively low thresholds. The term we use is these other transaction authorities, OTAs, and they just are a streamlined process, and the Tradewinds site, again, is intended to streamline the way you can get into those by having more normal pitches like videos and streamlined documents rather than the longer traditional contract pitches that I will just now trail off when talking about. And then once you get there, then you have your evaluation and your authority to operate. Again, we've tried to, in CDAO, we have an authorizing official, so if we have useful solutions, we can figure out how to approve them. We have enterprise level contract vehicles, and we know the ones that we don't have, so we can help match you to those longer term vehicles if the solutions prove scalable. But there's just kind of steps along in the process. And the last thing I'll just close with is a lot of times we talk about the defense budget, which the planning is really far out, and it makes it hard for startups. The truth is that is for scaled, large programs that need billions of dollars to sustain, and those don't happen overnight. So the steps I'm talking about are really ways where we can, knowing what we're going to need 2 years from now, we can start investing, going on the investment pathway for 24 to 36 months beforehand with clear contracts and approval processes to meet the budget where we get to help close that gap. And so that's kind of the arc we're trying to bring folks on with having a front door like the Tradewinds site.
Amazing. Time flew by. Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody, for leaning in, and have a great conference.
Thanks. I think I dropped a